You're listening to Girls with Grafts, a burn community podcast created by Phoenix Society for Burn Survivors, a leading nonprofit dedicated to supporting the burn community. In this podcast, we'll talk with burn survivors, share resources to help with supporting and improving burn recovery, and discuss how to prevent burn injuries. Here are your hosts, burn survivors and Phoenix Society's marketing team, Amber Wilcox and Rachel Kudlak.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Girls with Grafts. I am Rachel Kudlak. I'm one of the hosts of the show, and today I'm joined by my lovely co-host, Amber Wilcox.
Hi there. So excited to be here today, and we have another wonderful episode for everyone. So before we get started, we want to send a special shout out to today's podcast sponsor, Grafts. They are a personal injury firm dedicated to supporting burn survivors in New York and New Jersey. They understand the physical, emotional, and financial challenges that come with burn injuries and fight tirelessly to secure justice and compensation for their clients. You can receive a free consultation today by visiting grafts.com. We'll make sure we have that in the show notes as well. But Rachel, we would love it if you could introduce today's special guest for today's podcast.
Yes, so today we are welcoming on Donna McCartney. Donna has been a bereavement counselor with the Goldstein Family Grief Center since November 2020. She is a master in social work from Loyola University, Chicago, and has a master in healthcare administration from Ohio University. Prior to working at the Hospice of Cincinnati, she worked at the Shriners Hospital for Children, Cincinnati, where she provided support for patients and families following burn injuries, facilitated peer support programs, and developed programming for burn survivors and their families. Her experience as a clinician is extensive, from helping individuals and families navigate the unique challenges that present when grieving a death, loss, or other life-changing losses. Donna is passionate about being an advocate for those who are grieving and educating the community on grief and loss. So thank you so much, Donna, for joining us today.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Yeah, we're super excited to learn more a bit about your background and what led you into grief counseling. So let's start there.
So after working at the hospital for 15 years, I ended up making a switch when the hospital left Cincinnati and had the opportunity to pursue different career paths that seemed like it would align with the work that I had been able to do at Shriners Hospital. And so the role that was available here at the Goldstein Family Grief Center was so in line with the work that I had done, acknowledging the significant losses that people experience and helping them recognize that there is life that can be lived and joy and grief that can coexist.
It's amazing.
It is. Well, Donna, I'd love to talk a little bit more just about grief, especially when it comes, after trauma. I know, I'm sure a lot of your role now is today with the loss or the death of someone. But obviously our listeners, primarily burn survivors in the burn care field. So can you just kind of talk a little bit more about, what grief looks like or is, especially after trauma, like a burn injury?
Absolutely. So grief is the feelings and experiences that we live after navigating any loss. And I think culturally, we recognize grief after a death in most circumstances, but anybody that is living a major loss in their life has the potential to experience grief as a result of that. And I think when we talk about those that have been navigating burn injuries and the time after that, there's a lot of feelings and a lot of emotions that are going to come to the surface that are very consistent with the grief experience. Anger, frustration, disappointment, loneliness, isolation. There are just so many things that people experience over the course of a grief journey. And so we want to make sure that we acknowledge all of those things. We want to normalize those feelings and we want to validate those feelings.
Absolutely. I think that's a super important part of grief, right? Is acknowledging and not just pushing it away. I know, having dealt with my own sorts of grief, right? And not just with the burn trauma, I feel like pushing it away doesn't do anyone any good. So people most commonly experience grief around death, right? But grief can be experienced after any loss. So let's talk about like the typical losses that we feel after a burn injury.
I think the typical losses that you're going to experience after a burn injury are going to be, first and foremost, I think the overwhelming feeling of safety, depending on the circumstances surrounding the injury, that there is a perceived safety that we experience that we may not feel in the immediate time frame after a burn injury, and that is a loss. We are also helping people navigate a loss and change of appearance. If there has been significant scarring that is going to be noticeable, that there is a change in appearance that people have to adjust to and adapt to, and there can be lots of feelings associated with that. If there is an amputation, you may be looking at doing things in very different ways than how you've been able to do them before. Time in the hospital is time away from family, time away from friends, time away from work. There can just be so many different aspects of loss that people are navigating following a burn injury.
Yeah. And what are some of those like misconceptions, I guess, that maybe you see a lot when it comes to grief after a burn injury, whether someone, says they're not feeling it, or I'm fine, or I'm going to move on once I get home. But what are some of those, misconceptions that you see?
I think some of the challenges are that people feel that grief equals sadness. And so a lot of times people expect that they're going to be sad and they will acknowledge that as grief, but they might not recognize that grief can bring about anxiety. Grief can bring about lots of other feelings. It can be depression. It can be anger. It can be frustration. So I think it's recognizing that grief is so much more than just being sad. I think the other challenge is that people feel a sense of obligation to feel grateful for what they have. And grief and gratitude can exist simultaneously, but we don't have to ignore the grief in order to be grateful for what we have. And I think that that is a challenge that a lot of people experiences is I shouldn't be mad or sad because I survived and I'm here. And the very real overwhelming feelings that can come about also as a result of a burn injury need to be acknowledged and supported. Like you said earlier, Amber, our inclination is to push the hard things away and look towards what is going well. But we need to acknowledge all of it. We none of us exist with one single feeling after any single event. The analogy that I like to use is like when we are carrying grief and we are suppressing and just going through the motions and doing what we're supposed to be doing, we're filling up a balloon. And if you fill up a balloon too much, one of two things is going to happen. There is going to be an explosion. And everything that you have been pushing is going to pop when the balloon pops, and we feel completely and totally just shocked by the overwhelming emotion. Or if you let go of a balloon, you feel completely and totally out of control of what you're experiencing and out of control of your emotions. And so I think that idea of just plowing forward and just pushing this away, holding my gratitude and continuing to move forward and not acknowledging the other real and valid challenges leads to that suppression. And then that leads to everything coming to the surface and then being out of our control. So giving yourself permission to acknowledge, identify the feelings, talk about them, have an outlet for those things, sets you up for much more success when navigating a grief journey.
Absolutely. I think about when you were saying like feeling guilty too, I feel like we hear it a lot that family members often feel that way, right? They're thinking that like, oh, I'm glad it wasn't me, so I shouldn't have to experience grief. But there's a level of, I think, grief and sadness that comes along with being that other person as well, and trying to help someone through that. So I think that was important to acknowledge as well, is that grief isn't just about the person who was burned in this instance too.
And that the grief will look different for everybody.
Mm-hmm.
Grief is going to look different for individual burn survivors. Grief is going to look different for a survivor versus a family member. And it will look different for different family members within the same family. And that acknowledgement of there is so many unique aspects to grief, and they are all valid. We need to acknowledge them for what they are and how the grief is impacting us as individuals.
And speaking of that, I heard you say like anxiety, depression, right? So there's grief, and then there's all of these things inside of grief. Is that fair to say? Can you talk a little bit more about that?
I think there's a recognition of knowing how grief and loss can impact us in so many different ways. I think who we are as individuals leading up to a loss experience is very much going to play a role in how we navigate that grief experience. One of the things I talk about, especially with clients, and I think it is very true in the burn community as well, is if we have any kind of predisposition to depression or to anxiety, but we've been able to deploy coping tools, we've been able to navigate those challenges, and we learn how to live with those experiences. In the midst of grief and loss and trauma, we are depleted, and sometimes we don't have that internal coping ability because we are physically healing, because we are overwhelmed with so many more challenges than what we may have been navigating prior to that experience, that it's important to acknowledge that those things are normal, that we do expect that there can be challenges with anxiety, depression, and other challenges. And I think it's maintaining an awareness and allowing ourselves to access the support that we need when we need it. I think so often we as individuals feel like we are navigating very personal challenges and I need to navigate it on my own. But the reality is there is a need for grief to be witnessed and supported. And we want people to know that it is okay to acknowledge those challenges that are also very real and very valid.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. One thing too, Donna, I'm kind of curious about, and this is also partially, we started this season off with Maggie Gold, who's a social worker, and she kind of talked about how she worked in the ICU with families and survivors and that. So can you tell us a little bit more, I guess, like especially at your time at Shriners working with families, was that, were you kind of brought in always like right away to talk with the families about, their experience, or how do you see, or like, how do you work with survivors, especially still in that hospital setting?
I think the key to working with survivors and family members in the hospital setting is having a consistent supportive presence. I was very fortunate in our work at Shriners that we were able to connect with families. We were able to be that supportive presence. I don't think in a place like a burn unit where one person can be a primary psychosocial support person. And I know that obviously there are team members that fall in line with that psychosocial support aspect. But I think that the entire team being able to acknowledge and validate grief experiences, having that grief awareness makes such a big difference, because that way families are getting consistent messaging. Early on, we know that families aren't retaining information in the same way that they would. We're overwhelmed. There's so much new information. There are so many things that are happening in the midst of an acute crisis. We go into survival mode, and there isn't a capacity to process and acknowledge grief and loss for what it is. In those early weeks, I don't think people even recognize what they are grieving. But it's giving tools, it's giving information, it's using that language and using language consistently so people recognize that these are normal and valid experiences. But I think providing safe spaces, meeting families where they are, and allowing them the opportunity to process and talk when they come to that time and space. And it's a fine act. It's a balancing act, right? Because the healthcare becomes the priority, but grief impacts the whole person. And so there is an awareness that we do want to acknowledge the grief and loss that people are experiencing early on. But I think a lot of that processing continues over the course of time. We lay the foundation for it early on in the hospital stay, and then it's maintaining the conversation, maintaining that communication, and providing that consistent support through a hospitalization, into clinic for reconstructive surgeries. Those all have the capacity to bring grief to the surface again in very different ways, depending on age, development, and where they are in life down the road.
Donna, I see it a lot, I think, in like older generations where there's a lot of denial, right, of mental health and support. Rachel came on, so I don't know if, Rachel, you agree with me, you're laughing here, but like sweeping it under the rug was, I feel like, an older generation's like approach to things. What would you say to maybe support someone who's kind of in their own denial, right, of how they're feeling?
I think that there are absolutely generational differences when it comes to grief and loss, when it comes to mental health. I think that we acknowledge those differences and then provide opportunities for conversation, provide education. I've been the grief counselor here for the past 5 years, but stepped into a new role recently for community outreach and education with the goal of creating a grief inclusive city. And I feel like in order to be grief inclusive, we have to become grief informed. And I really, truly believe that providing education and information is the only way that we are going to shift that. So if we are getting resistance for those that don't necessarily acknowledge the grief and loss and emotional challenges, but recognize only the physical challenges, we continue to give information. We continue to provide those support and resources, offer opportunities to connect with other survivors that can normalize and validate that experience in a very different way. And the Phoenix Society does so many of those things through the SOAR program and World Burn and all of those opportunities that we can just provide education and help people see it from different perspectives. But we can't force grief counseling. We can't force mental health counseling. We get those calls a lot from really well-intentioned family members and loved ones who want us to offer support and see someone for grief counseling. And I can't have somebody come in my office for grief counseling and be the one that
don't want to. Yeah.
So there has to be that acknowledgement that they have to want to participate. But I think so much of that comes down to the education component and helping them understand the why behind it. And a lot of that is going beyond the physical aspect and recognizing like a burn injury impacts your entire self. It's not TBSA. It's not location where the burn injury is. That impacts our entire self. And to take care of yourself after a burn injury means acknowledging the grief and loss that you've experienced.
I like that a lot.
Yeah. And Donna, obviously, some people may feel comfortable going to a one-on-one, session and talking about their grief, but what are some other tools or tips would you give if maybe someone's not quite ready to make that step, or maybe they don't have access to, a formal grief center or something like that? What are some tools and tips you'd want to share with them?
I think recognizing, how do I take care of my entire self? And I think really kind of taking an inventory, or what are the things that I need? One of those questions might mean, why don't I feel ready yet? What is the barriers to getting me that support? And what support feels like it is best for me? Some people might be keen on going individual counseling, and that might work for them. Other people might be seeking out support groups. And what does that support group model look like? Does the hospital or burn center where you're receiving your care offer programs, getting connected with that, or am I not able to participate? So I reach out to the Phoenix Society. It's taking an inventory of what all of the options are, so that you can get the support that is most meaningful and most helpful for you. It was interesting. I titled different programs different things. Some people are very willing to come to individual counseling. That feels like that would be a safe and supportive environment. Amber, you alluded to it earlier. There are some people that really don't recognize individual counseling as something that would be mainstream or normative for them. So they put up a barrier before they recognize the benefit. Those people might be willing to go to a support group, Other people might be willing to go to an educational workshop. So we offer a wide variety of programs to really help people acknowledge, okay, there are lots of opportunities. Where can I put myself into a safe space for me that would be most helpful and most beneficial for me?
Mm-hmm. Can you talk a little bit more about how peer support, whether that's a support group, Phoenix, or whatever it may be, but kind of how peer support can play a role in, healing from grief?
Absolutely. So obviously I was well connected with Phoenix and the SOAR program when I was at Shriners, and we actually use peer support volunteers now in my new position to co-facilitate our support groups that we offer. And I think there's something to be said about that co-facilitation model. I love that I can speak to things from a clinical experience. Every family I worked with at the hospital, I was able to say, you know what? I have seen how many families go through this recovery process. I was never able to say that I lived that experience. Many of the clients that I'm working with here, I've experienced different losses, but not necessarily the losses that they have experienced. So clinical support is important from a grief and support model. However, there is a normalization and a validation that comes from hearing somebody talk about the lived experience that is similar to your lived experience, to be able to acknowledge the challenges that maybe you haven't had the words for yet, or you haven't been able to say out loud yet. I think it helps people develop their stories. It acknowledges just how much we are impacted by burn injuries in so many ways. It never ceases to amaze me in the support groups when the peer supporters are talking, just the relief in other people's faces to hear somebody say out loud the things that they have been thinking and feeling. And there's just something to be said about knowing somebody has maybe not walked the same path, but has had to forge a path from a grief perspective or a burn injury perspective, and that they have been able to do it and they are continuing to do it. That gives hope that I too will find my way on this path. And it might look different, but I have the capacity to be able to do this.
I know not everyone has access to maybe some of the same resources that others do. Now we do have the online community, which is really helpful. But what might you offer someone that either isn't, we talked about information and resources being a first step for some people. Where do you recommend, or where do you point folks to in those instances?
I think honestly, the resources and the tools available through the Phoenix Society, I use a lot of print materials here that we have. I use a number of written handouts, and we also have created some worksheets that really help people to, okay, I can see this from a global perspective, and this is how I apply it to my life. One of my favorite handouts that we developed here is a grieving with intention. So it is, how do I take care of all of the aspects of myself? So how am I taking care of my physical self? How am I taking care of my spiritual, emotional, mental, and intellectual self? And we have examples on a handout that we give people to really think about those. How do I take care of myself from that perspective when I'm navigating grief and loss? And then I have a handout so that they can fill in, how do I take care of myself, knowing who I am, knowing what I need. When you hand people a handout like that, they look at something that says social health, and they're like, I'm not ready to go out and see everybody and do everything. And social doesn't necessarily mean I have to say yes to every invitation that comes in. It means that I need to make sure that I'm being intentional to take care of what I need from a social perspective. Physical perspective. Your physical abilities may have changed following a burn injury. So I may have to stop and kind of catalog what I used to be doing. How do I do that in a meaningful and helpful way for me now? So I think that that's one of the things that if we're looking at things we can do on our own, taking some of those inventories of where I am, what do I need? How am I taking care of me? From a grief perspective, there are some great resources online that you can navigate. What's Your Grief is a great online resource for navigating different aspects of grief, for that reinforcement aspect of these are very normal, real feelings, and they're very valid experiences. But I think definitely being willing to introspectively look at yourself to see, what do I need? What is best for me? And then how do I access that? Do I have people? Do I need to get online? If you are in a rural area and you don't have as many resources, it might mean finding support in different places or different spaces than you might have expected. I do think one of the things that we recognize in grief is one of the losses is sometimes the people we think are going to show up for us don't. And that is very true. And that is a significant loss for a lot of people. However, the caveat to that is we also have the capacity to be very intentional to find people who can support us. And we can acknowledge the hurt and disappointment that it comes from not necessarily being who we thought it might be, but also very much accept and welcome the support in the places that it comes from, whether it's us seeking it out or it's people finding us along the way to offer that support.
I think it's important that, you're holding space no matter what I think the situation is. And so that can be very important. And I think we have to acknowledge, like, everyone does, I guess, react to it differently. When we talked a little bit about that, but children in particular, right, may react in a very different way than adults. Can we talk a little bit about that?
Well, I think the recognition and acknowledgement of children continuing to grieve over the course of development, and that recognition of, depending on when the injury occurs, there are going to be developmental variables that impact the grief responses during that time. And then if it is a child that sustains an injury at a young age, they're going to have an increasing awareness over the course of time. And I think that recognition of grief is not something that we get over, but grief is something that we learn to carry. Grief is something that is very much going to be a part of who we are. We recognize that kids' grief is going to continue to evolve and change over the course of time. I think the American Academy of Pediatrics has a great approach. It's the CARES approach to support resilience in kids, but it's making sure that kids have a safe space where they are able to talk and not shutting them down. That being said, kids are going to ask the hardest questions at the most inconvenient times and in the most awkward of places. And so they're checkout line at the restaurant. But it's that recognition of, we always want to meet kids safely wherever they are. And so if it is a conversation that could be hard, repeating back what they've asked so that you know that they've heard the question, and then making sure to revisit it, and that we continue to go back and visit it. We always want to acknowledge a child's concerns. We don't want to minimize. We don't want to say that's not something to worry about. We want to acknowledge, if they're bringing it up, this is something that you are fearful of, or this is something that you're thinking about. We want that to be acknowledged, and we want that to be witnessed. We want to make sure that they know that they're not alone, that they are safe, and that they are supported, and engaging them in age-appropriate play and activities as best as they are able to keep them connected and doing what they are able to. We recognize they might be learning to do things again. They might be doing them differently than they did before, differently than peers, but we want to support and maintain that engagement, and then sharing honest and age-appropriate information. Everybody wants to protect their children. And honestly, that's true across the board, that regardless of how old your child is, we want to protect our children. But recognizing, if kids are asking questions, they probably already have information composed in their minds. So we want to give them real and accurate information. And I think that is so incredibly important at the time of an injury. But then they're going to continue to experience this over the course of development in different ways. So there is that moment of having a hard conversation and breathing a sigh of relief of, whew, I was dreading that and I got through it. And then you realize you have to have that conversation again, because these questions are going to continue to come to the surface. And so we want to welcome those conversations whenever they come up and not dismissing, because we don't want people to feel minimized because it's been a period of time since the injury happened, but also the awareness of they're living it in a very different way with more awareness. And we don't want it to feel minimized years down the road any differently than we would have wanted them to feel it early on.
No, it's such, so true, especially with kids, like you said, kind of having to have those tough conversations more than once. So I guess, do you have tips for, parents and caregivers who are listening who, maybe their child's now a teenager and they don't want to talk about their injury. They don't even want to talk to you, mom or dad, at all, because, you're not cool anymore if you're a teenager. How do you, I guess, what tips do you have for them to know, obviously they want their child to be protected and feel supported, but maybe they just really don't want to talk about it right now? I guess, how do you balance that?
I think it's a fine line. You are 100% correct. There are lots of times where teens are feeling that hyper independence. They want to lean on peers versus parents. I think it's continuing to offer the opportunities for the conversation. It's continuing to acknowledge that there might be ongoing challenges that come up. I'd say recognizing timing can be key. It's a good opportunity to have a conversation about how they might be feeling about an injury when you're in the car on the way to clinic or in the car on the way home. When they're in that space, I think anticipating and following up appointments and surgeries, when they're in that space, you're more likely to be able to engage them, and recognizing that those are opportunities. And if you observe changes in behavior, if you're observing interactions with peers, interactions with family, being able to say, I know that you might not want to talk to me about this, but I have seen this, and I can't help but wonder if it might be helpful to have a conversation with me, or can we get you connected with somebody that you can talk to? If it's not going to be me that you talk to, can we connect with one of the counselors? Give them opportunities and other people. Who are their people that they can talk to? Every parent wants to be that safe space. But as I said earlier, how much parents want to protect children, that also goes in reverse, that children want to protect their parents from challenges and struggles. So I think offering opportunities of places and spaces where they can get the support that they need. The key is getting the support, and offering the opportunities.
Yeah, and it's so interesting to hear you talk about the children protecting the parents, because I definitely feel like I did some of that. I was burned when I was 3, and then growing up, I was also a Shriners kid. My parents were taking such good care of me, physically and emotionally, but I also didn't want to be the bother to kind of going back to I'm grateful that I have these opportunities to go to Shriners, to get my healing, to continue to grow and act normally. But then I didn't want to ever talk about, the emotional side of things, because it was well, I should be grateful that I'm having these opportunities. So why would I be sad when I could just be happy and not think about it?
And I think we need to flip that thought process, because I think that is so many people, that it doesn't have to be one or the other. It can be both. But no one is ever taught, when someone says, how are you, that you can say happy and sad, or grieving and grateful. We always tend to choose one, and we tend to choose whichever one is in the positive.
Definitely. I like the grieving and grateful term.
I have a Venn diagram that I use that has that overlap, where you can be grieving and grateful, and that you can be in that space. Now, some days you might be very much in a grieving space, and some days you might be very much in a grateful space, but it's the recognition that they are both coexisting in our lives.
Right. I think we continue to go by the I'm not allowed to feel this way, right? And that such a hard statement, right? To stop using, right? I'm not allowed to feel sad because I'm trying to just be grateful. In that, I think just starting to allow ourselves to feel the way we feel is important.
Well, in all of the language that we use surrounding emotion, especially like sadness and tears, is all stated in the negative.
Yes.
I'm a hot mess. I'm a train wreck. I'm Debbie Downer. I'm sobbing. I'm blubbering. Like all of the language that we use surrounding emotion has a negative connotation. And I'm not saying that we need to put rose-colored glasses and turn it into a positive, but the acknowledgement of let's use neutral language. I'm a grieving human. To be able to validate that.
I think that's so important. And even just in our lives in general, like I know even like I have a toddler and I've been trying to teach my son, like, it's okay to be sad, right? It's okay to be like, we use such negative, like even just with our own emotions that like growing up, this wasn't that we were never taught, right? To feel like it's okay to start crying or whatnot. We're always like, stop that. All right. So it's, as a parent, I've had to like try to reframe that thinking that I was taught of like, okay, it's okay to be sad, but it's how, like how we're dealing with our emotions. And that's such a hard thing to learn yourself when that's like all you were programmed to be kind of taught growing up. We always use that negative language of our feelings. And so it's really hard even to parent it and try to change that thinking to say like, it's okay, we're sad. We have to change the way we talk about our emotions.
Our inclination is to say, you're a big kid now, stop crying.
Yeah.
And the reality is you're a scared 5-year-old or you are an injured 10-year-old.
Let's talk about our feelings. Yep.
I talk about tears all the time. I recognize, I want people to say that tears are a physiological response to stress, trauma, and pain. And they are not, it's not something that can be quantifiable. It's not something that we can do too much of or too less of. It is an individual reaction.
And that's what our body needs at that point in time. Yeah.
It's a physiological release. I told a 9-year-old once that was struggling with crying, I said, that's no different than peeing. It is a physiological response. He was not buying it, but I've used it in a lot of other presentations and people are like, I've never thought about it like that. Like tears have so much social stigma and weight associated that we need to take it back to. It is indeed a physiological response of the human body. It is a release. And it is a release that we need. And the more neutral language that we can use, the more kindness and compassion we can extend to ourselves when we are the ones crying, and the more kindness and compassion that we can extend to those who are crying around us or experiencing.
I think the same applies for anger, right? Like we talk about, like, it's not okay. Like I have to do the same for my son. Like, okay, you can be angry. Like I'll sit here and wait for you to be finished. We're not going to, it's our response to anger, right? And our response to crying, like we're not going to throw things. We're not going to hit. Like those are not positive reactions to, right? Or reactions that I want you to handle your anger. Like, so let's teach coping skills for that. But it's a very hard thing when you were programmed or, the society teaches us like we can't cry, we can't be angry. You can have those emotions. It's how we handle those emotions. And so I feel like as a parent, it's like been very difficult for me to like, okay, try to, right. And then when that person's angry or that person's sad, you feel inclined to be sad or angry too. So we're going through it right now. And it's always funny to talk about because yes, like we are taught those things and it's always frustrating to try to like figure out, okay, how are we going to work through this moving forward?
And then there's the reality of knowing something and then living it that are so incredibly challenging. And the social conditioning aspect, we talked about the generational differences and we have been shifting some of the ways we look at anger and emotions. We obviously didn't have Inside Out and the other movies.
Great movies that teach emotions. Yeah.
We watched Inside Out too, and my 5-year-old was running around the house yelling, I love anxiety. And I said, I hope you always embrace that. That recognition and the awareness of we are at least giving language now for things that we maybe didn't have words for before even. So we're starting with vocabulary, but all of these shifts from an emotional perspective and a grief and loss perspective are changes that are going to take place over the course of time. So there is an awareness and a recognition of how we support kids navigating a burn injury today is really going to help them over the course of development. And it's going to continue to help shift that paradigm as time goes on.
even just talking about our feelings in general, I feel like was just not right. Like, so now we're at least talking about them, and then we have to figure out how to approach talking about them.
I just have a little picture of, I've never met your son, but just a little kid running around screaming, "I love anxiety." And like,
it's so sweet.
It's such a good movie. If you haven't watched it, Inside Out 2, very good. And that one I think is also a little bit more geared toward adults. So it's even better in my opinion.
Mm-hmm.
I will say that I have used that like who's on the control panel right now? What do we need to do? And it gave them language for emotion, and it is definitely could be a good tool to help kids on burn units for sure.
Yeah, so true. Well, Donna, we do want to kind of switch gears a little bit here. One thing we've been doing a little bit more of this season is just a quick lightning round of myths or truths. So Amber and I will read a statement, and then you can say if it's a myth or a truth. And if you have a little something to share with it, you can go ahead and do that. So I'm going to go first. My first statement is keeping busy helps you move on faster.
Myth. There is no moving on from grief. Keeping busy can sometimes be a tool that is necessary for people. Some people need distraction. They need a reprieve from their grief. But the myth in that statement is that there is a moving on from grief. It is very much how do we learn to live with and carry grief. It's a balancing act. It's not one or the other.
Mm-hmm.
I know, because we also say that right in our language, like, oh, why aren't you moved on from it yet? Like, okay, that's not how I'm coping with it.
I have a great reflection that we use a lot called living on, which the language is so symbolic. And we can live on, but moving on feels like we're not honoring the losses that we've experienced.
All right. Grief and depression are the same thing.
They are not.
I think we touched on that a little bit earlier.
Yeah. And I know we touched on this one a little bit just now, but grief will eventually go away completely.
It does not. Grief is absolutely a backpack that we continue to carry. It evolves and it changes over the course of time. It is not as intense as it is in the beginning always. But there's always the capacity to have a grief day down the road.
Let's talk a little bit about laughter during grief. Is disrespectful or wrong? I really like this one.
I don't think it is disrespectful or wrong. I think that humor has to have a context. And I think that is meeting a person where they are. So if the person that is navigating the loss is leaning into that and acknowledging that, and you are seeing that from them, you can meet them where they are. I don't think we should ever use that as a distraction to bring somebody out of a different space where they are.
Really like that. I know at Phoenix World Burn Congress, we have had like a laughter or comedy session before. And I think it just really pinpoints what you just said of some survivors they love it. Some survivors aren't ready for that or don't find it funny, which both are right. You know, you don't have to enjoy that. You also, if that's how you like to grieve and, you know, make it a little bit more lighthearted through jokes and laughter, then that's also okay. But yeah, and also just, yeah, like you said, knowing your audience, when is the time appropriate? I really like that. And then our last statement is grief only affects your emotions. It doesn't show up physically.
No, grief impacts our entire self. I don't know at what point in time we decided to separate the brain and the body, but there is just so much interconnectivity in how we're feeling and our energy levels. Our overall health is very much can be impacted. We know that we feel stress and trauma physically. And so just having an awareness, I think, to go back to one of the early questions we talked about when we were acknowledging the generational differences, that has been perpetuated. Like grief is in our head and we just need to be able to keep moving. And I think the recognition that grief impacts our whole self. And similar to what I said earlier, that acknowledgement of neutral language and grief and tears being a physiological response, grief is something that impacts us. And I think when we can recognize all of the ways in which we're impacted by it, that is when we can take care of our best selves. That is when we extend that kindness and compassion to ourselves. And that is what gives us the permission to start moving forward too.
I always think, so I'm always been like a person that holds things in. And I recognize, like, after my burn injury, but even throughout, like, since, I hold like all of my emotions in my body. And so I recognize, like, it's always very important for me to go and get a massage. That's just how it is. And I always feel like a completely new person when I walk out of that like spa, because I've released the like physical aspects, and like you don't realize how much you'll hold physically in your body in terms of tension and things like that until you walk in there and like you've had someone given the opportunity to kind of relax and given your space to kind of like find that relaxation. And so I will say, like, as somebody who does hold like grief or tension or anything and stress in my body, I recognize like that's what I need. Right. And so I think until you've had that opportunity, sometimes you don't realize how much grief or tension you're holding for whatever is where you're dealing with at that time. So I think that's always super important.
It impacts physical, it impacts our cognition, our ability to think clearly and be fully present. I think it is having an awareness of how it impacts us as individuals and knowing what we can do to take care of ourselves. And to be able to acknowledge that is an incredible gift that we can give ourselves.
Absolutely. And I think sleep also pays into that, right? Like when we're grieving, we're supposed to be getting the rest that we need, but sometimes it's hard, right, to get the appropriate amount of rest too. So that's definitely something that impacts kind of our healing.
And the sleep aspect, that's one of the things, the people that stay busiest during the day in the midst of grief, I think stay busy to avoid all of the grief coming to the surface. So then they're physically exhausted, but when they lay down at night, they no longer have the distraction. And so then their brain goes to all of those spaces, and then we have disrupted sleep. I think if we can be intentional to acknowledge our grief and take care of ourselves and tap into that grieving with intention concept that I talked about earlier, and have some regular acknowledgement of the grief that we're carrying, that then contributes to us being able to find some more of that wellness that takes out some of the stress we carry in our bodies, that takes out some of the complications that we might have with sleep as well.
That's such a good point. I know I'm the type of person that will, if I stay busy, then I don't think about it. And then if I don't think about it, I'll be fine. But it's so funny because it's exactly what happens. You get physically exhausted and then you lay down and then you can't sleep. Your brain
takes over.
Time to think.
And there's no distraction.
Yep. Well, I know, Donna, we're coming up on our time. But before we ask our two final quick questions, I do just want to ask, how do you, and actually I'll save that one for kind of our final, but maybe for someone who's listening today, who's in that early raw stage of grief, what's maybe one piece of advice you want to share with them?
I think the most important thing early on is to be patient with yourself. And to let yourself be where you are. Because I think so often in so many aspects of grief and in life, we want to be anywhere other than where we are in those moments, especially in those hard moments. And recognizing that you are on the journey that you are on and you are in the midst of challenges, but that there's going to be an evolution. There will be change. There are going to be resources and support that will play a role in that continued journey. But there is not a fast forward button to get us around it, over it, through it, whatever language we want to use, that we have to be in the spaces that we are in to help us find the path forward that we need to be on.
I love that.
But there's always hope.
So speaking of hope, one of our final questions this season, we've focused this season quite a bit on hope. So what do you do? I'm sure you've experienced grief in some way in your life, but what gives you hope, or, the ability to carry that backpack like we've talked about here in this episode, when things are feeling heavy?
I think the recognition of there is always going to be the potential to walk into a different space. And we are taking all of us when we go into each of those spaces. So when you are grieving a death loss, there is an acknowledgement and a recognition that we continue to carry the people that we've lost with us into those new places and spaces. And I think there is a recognition after a burn injury, when you are going into new spaces and places and you are overcoming things that you may not have thought possible at some point early on in your recovery, that you are doing that with the things that you learned prior to the injury. And so you are always taking who you are with you into those places and spaces. And I think it's a recognition of, I don't have to leave things behind because of losses. It's how do I continue to carry and incorporate those people, those losses, those experiences into who I am today, because the good, the bad, the ugly, they all make us who we are.
I love that. Well, Donna, it is time for our final question, which today is our Phoenix Partner question, sponsored by Grabber and MHA, is what do you hope someone listening to this podcast today feels or learns?
I think the recognition that grief is very much a real and valid experience following a burn injury. And I think the recognition of not having to do it alone, and also how important it is to extend kindness and compassion to yourself in the process.
Amazing. Well, Donna, thank you so much for joining us today on the podcast. Quick teaser too for anyone who is coming to Phoenix World Burn Congress. Donna will be there. It's in her hometown, so we're looking forward to that this November. But yeah, we so appreciate you coming on and talking to us all about grief. I know it's a heavy topic, but I think we shed a lot of light on it today.
Well, thank you for the opportunity.
Super helpful.
Yes, thank you for the opportunity. And I hope to see lots of familiar faces at World Burn in Northern Kentucky, and hopefully meet some new people along the way as well.
Thank you.
So, thank you.
Thanks so much for tuning in to this episode of Girls with Grafts. If you are enjoying this content, please feel free to rate, subscribe, and leave a review wherever you listen to your podcasts. This helps others find the show, and we greatly appreciate it. Thanks again for listening, and we'll catch you in the next episode.